Feeling overwhelmed with all the weird jargon and frustrating terms in mixing? Well, let's do something about that. Crack open your textbooks, because today we're going back to school. It's time to learn all things signal flow. Stay tuned. Hello everybody, Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission here. I've got another mixing tutorial for you. Today we're going to be talking mixing terminology, audio jargon, the stuff that you read in the manuals and you read in the articles and you hear about in the YouTube videos that is just so confusing because you simply don't know the vocabulary yet. And I totally get it. One of the biggest barriers of entry for me whenever I was first getting started was the fact that, I knew a lot of the concepts, but I had no idea what these words that people were throwing around actually meant, what they actually referred to. So today, we are going to be focusing in on signal flow, which is some of the most confusing stuff in the audio world. Once you learn it, it makes total sense. But getting that initial momentum going can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. Now, one important thing to say here, this is the first video of a series that we're going to be doing all over different audio jargon. We've got a few on mixing, we've got some on recording. We're going to be linking those videos once they get released down in the description below. So if you get to the end of this video and you're hungry for more, check down in the description. There might be a little extra something waiting for you. So like I said, today we're going to be focusing in on signal flow. And let's start off with that word. Signal flow is something that is all-encompassing. There's tons of different words that sort of fall underneath that banner. But the word itself is a little confusing. So here's what signal flow means. So signal flow refers to the path that a signal travels from the input of a system all the way to the output of a system. So this might sound more confusing than it needs to be, so let's talk about it in terms of audio. For recording, this signal is the sound of an instrument that you've got a microphone on. It's flowing through the microphone into your audio interface, into your computer, and then finally being turned into an audio file in your DAW. Now, for mixing, this signal is the sound of an audio file flowing through your DAW, all of your plugins, all of your channel routing, which we'll talk about in a second, all the way to your stereo output and then into your speakers or your headphones. So let's look at an example for mixing. Now, in your DAW, which stands for Digital Audio Workstation, by the way, there's a little bonus jargon thrown in there for you. Inside of your DAW, you're going to have different audio files. Now, all of your audio files are going to be on channels. Now, all a channel is, it's like a piece of piping. It's going to pick up the actual audio itself. The audio is going to flow through the channel, and then it's going to flow first into a plugin, like, for example, maybe an EQ plugin. And then after this EQ plugin, it'll flow into the next plugin that you put on here. Maybe a compressor plugin. After that, it'll flow down through your volume fader, which all a volume fader is the part of a channel that controls how loud the amplitude or the level of a particular audio file is. And then it would flow into your pan pot. And the pan pot is the thing that allows you to move an audio track to the left or to the right. Now, all this might seem really basic. The important thing to know is that the sound of an audio file starts on the file itself, and then it goes into a channel. It goes into your plugins, one plugin after another, your volume fader, your pan pot, and then whatever your channel's output is. So right now I have it set to the stereo output. It'll flow through the stereo output and then out into our speakers. So why does signal flow matter? Well, for one, the order that you put your plugins is going to change the sound a little bit. We actually have a video that we've already done that covers that concept exactly. The other reason why signal flow is important is because you can actually change the direction of the flow to change how the audio is being affected. Now, that might sound a little confusing, so let's break it down with a helpful metaphor. So let's think about signal flow literally, as a flow of water. Each of these instruments is like its own individual pool, and each of these pools is going to flow to one place, the stereo output, right? That's the channel that goes out to your speakers. So for this, it's kind of like our spigot that if we turn it on, we want all of the water to flow out of it. So that means that all of these reservoirs, these channels, all connect to the stereo output. But what if we wanted to change the direction of the flow? Well, then we'd want to use some different pipes. So the pipes that we use in mixing are known as buses. Buses are like the pipelines that connect one channel to another channel. But in terms of our DAW, what are our actual pipes? Well, those are called aux tracks or auxiliary tracks. So an aux track is just a channel without an audio file on it, but one that has audio directed into it for processing. These are the pipes of your DAW. Basically, if your DAW has a track and it doesn't have an audio file on it, it's an aux track. So how do these two things relate? Well, if you create a bus in your DAW, then you're automatically going to create a new aux track. A bus has to direct to some specific pipe. So for example, if I wanted to go over to my output and I wanted to change the output of my kick from the stereo output, which is what the speakers flow into, to something else, another aux track. Well, I'd go down to bus, which remember is just like the pipeline that connects my channel to a new channel. I'll go and I'll select bus 1. So let's go to our mixer. And you can see, the output is bus 1, and all the way over here to our right, we've created a new aux track. And the input of the aux track is also bus 1. So we now have a new pipe that our audio file is flowing into. Now, let me solo this, and what should happen is we'll be able to hear the kick. Perfect. Now, if I was to mute this channel, we wouldn't be able to hear the kick anymore. That's because we're basically cutting off the flow of audio at this particular pipe. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So we're hearing the kick now. If I hit mute, it's gone. So we know what buses are now, we know what aux tracks are now, but what would we actually create with these new pipes? Why would we use them? Well, there's two things that you would use the pipes of your DAW to create, either an output bus or a send. So let's talk about output buses. Now, this is a bit of a confusing term because two different pieces of jargon use the same word. So bus, like we've been talking about, is kind of like the switchboard for our pipeline in our DAW, whereas an output bus is like the destination of that pipeline. Now, there are three different kinds of output buses: an instrument bus, the mix bus, and a sub-mix bus. Let's go over all three. An instrument bus is when you set the output of multiple audio files, usually of the same instrument, to one single bus. That means they're all going to flow into one aux track. You can think of it like you're connecting multiple different audio reservoirs into one single pipeline. So anything that you do on that pipeline is going to affect all of those audio files. And this is why it's so common in mixing. It can make mixing way easier, and it can create a lot of glue in your mixes. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So for example, I might want to come in here and select all of my drums. So my kick, my snares, my toms. I might want to give all of them one instrument bus, just a drum bus. So I'd select all of these channels, and I'd go over here, and I'd select one single bus. Let's select bus 1. So now the output of all of these different channels, all of my different drum recordings, my drum microphones, they're all flowing into bus 1. So let me go over to aux 1. We'll call this drum bus. This is bus 1. So now if I solo this, we should hear the entire drum set. And if I mute it, we should lose the drum set entirely. Rolling down the road, and it's gone. And the radio. So that means anything that we do to this track is going to get applied to everything. So for example, let's turn down the volume. Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio. Or maybe let's pan it. Slowing down the mountain as there's no way we're going slow. Or most helpfully, let's start adding some plugins. So for example, if I added an EQ, I can change the tone of the entire drum set. Rolling down the road. Or if I added a compressor, I could squeeze the entire drum set together to create a little bit more cohesion. Just like this.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio. Slowing down the mountain as if no way we're going slow.
So you'll often see instrument buses used for every single instrument in a mix. There'll be a drum bus, an electric guitar bus, an acoustic guitar bus, a piano bus, a vocal bus, a background vocal bus. That way you can do any kind of processing and any kind of panning or turning the volume up and down and have it be applied to all of the instruments in your mix. It's a great way to speed up your workflow, and it's a great way to create more glue and cohesion in your entire mix. So now let's talk about the next kind of output bus, the mix bus. So the mix bus is something we've actually been talking about throughout this video, the stereo output. There's a lot of different names for this: stereo output, mix bus, mix output, master output, master bus, but all of those are referring to the same thing. It's just the final channel that all of your audio flows into and then out into your speakers. So in other words, this aux track is like the spigot that all of the audio reservoirs connect to, so that every single time you open the spigot, you see the water coming out. And when the water comes out, you hear it in your speakers. So this isn't just used as the final place for all of the audio to flow into, it's also used as a place to create a little bit of glue, just like we did with our instrument buses. But for this, it's going to be creating more cohesion in the entire mix. So if I was to add an EQ onto this, for example, you're going to hear the entire mix get brighter or darker.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio. Slowing down the mountain as if no way we're going slow.
So anytime you hear people talk about mix bus processing, they're talking about putting on plugins like saturation, EQ, compression at the very beginning of the mix to create a good foundation for the mix to rest on. It's kind of just edging the entire song in the right direction before you really ever even get started. So finally, let's talk about submix buses. So this is a bit of a confusing one because some people use this term for the mix bus. Some people, when they say, oh, everything's going to the submix, they just mean everything's flowing into the stereo output, the mix bus, the master output, whatever. So here's my hot take. Those people are wrong. What submix buses really are midway points that multiple instrument buses all flow into that are kind of more about general groupings of instruments. And then those submix buses flow into your stereo output, your mix bus. So for example, you might have 3 different submixes, one for your rhythm instruments, one for your melodic instruments, and one for everything else. For your rhythm submix, you direct your drums and your bass there. For your melodic submix, you direct your vocals and any other melodic instruments there. And for the final submix, I usually call that the harmony submix, and that's where you would just direct everything else. So let me quickly create an example of what we're talking about. So I've set up this mix so that each of my instruments has their own individual instrument bus. So you can see the drums have their drum bus, the bass has its bass bus, each guitar part has its own bus because I'm probably going to want to affect each of those differently since all the tones are differently. The organ has its own bus, the piano has its own bus, the vocals have their own bus, and the background vocals have their own bus. Now all of these, you can see the outputs are all set to stereo output. So what would I want to do to create submix buses? Well, I'd want to change these stereo outputs to their own bus. I'm creating new pipelines so that the audio has new places to flow into. And I'm going to want multiple different pipes to flow to the same place. So let's actually create our submixes. So the first submix is the rhythm submix. So that's going to be our drum bus and our bass bus. So I'm going to select both of these and I'm going to change the output to a new bus, bus 12. Now you can see, because I created a new pipeline, over here, a new aux track has popped up with that pipeline being the input, bus 12. We'll just call it rhythm. So that's the rhythmic sub bus. So when I solo it, you'll be able to hear that all I hear are the drums and the bass. So now that we've created our rhythmic submix, let's create our melody submix. And that's, at this point, just going to be our vocal bus and our background vocal bus. Now, throughout the song, I might be listening through, maybe there's a guitar solo or a piano melody or something like that. I'm going to want to route those to this melody submix as well, just so that I have full control over all of the melodies in the mix. But for now, the only ones I know of are the lead vocals and the background vocals that are doing that like bop, bop kind of sound, because that's not necessarily just a harmony. That is a full different counter melody. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to select bus 13. You can see a new aux track, new aux channel just got created with the input bus 13. So we're going to call this melody. And if I solo it, all we're going to hear are the background vocals and the vocals.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio. Bop, 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 ba-da-da-da.
Great. So now we want to create our harmonic submix. And that's just going to be everything else. That's sort of the dump spot for most of the rest of the instruments. If they don't feel like they belong in rhythm or melody, then they're probably going to live in harmony. So I'm just going to grab the rest of my buses and I'm going to select bus 14, and it looks like a new aux track just got created. We're going to call that harmony. And if we solo this, it's going to be everything except for the rhythm and the melody. Very cool. So now that I have these three submixes, I can control their volume whenever I want.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
Just like this.
Blowing down the map.
I can also add any kind of processing that I want. So I may want to add some compression on the rhythm submix to kind of glue all that together. Maybe I'd want to add an EQ on the melodic submix and boost, a little bit of the highs so that all of my melodies are sticking out of the mix a little bit more. Now, one thing that's important to know, submixes are not super commonly used. Now, I use them personally. I like using them, but I didn't actually start using them until I was many years into my mixing journey. For me, if I was to give you a recommendation, if you're wanting to take away some mixing techniques from this, I would focus in on instrument buses and your mix bus. Start using submixes once you master those other two, and you want to get just a little bit more control over the different parts of your actual mix. So that's everything that you need to know about output buses. But if you remember, I said that was only one half of what you could do with all of the piping in your DAW. So now let's talk about sends. A send is a routing function inside of your DAW that allows you to send a copy of a particular audio file to an aux track without actually affecting the sound of the original file. So to clear up some confusion, let's take a look at our pipes again. Creating a send is like creating a parallel pipeline and directing some of the flow of water through that pipe. So it's going to be going through the original pipe that it was going through, and it's going to be going through a secondary pipe. Now, the cool thing about this is that I can do anything I want to this secondary parallel pipeline, and it's going to flow into the stereo output all the same. So I can do some crazy effects on this parallel pipe, and then just allow a little bit of water to flow out of that pipe into our spigot, into our actual stereo output, our mix bus. So the reason sends are so helpful is that it allows us to actually create effects on particular instruments without changing the sound of the original file. It allows us to create some really aggressive sounds and then just mix them in a little bit to give the sound a little bit more color. So let me show you an example. I'm going to go over to my vocal bus. I'm going to create a new send. And to do that in Logic, all I have to do is click on this little gray box. I'm going to select a new bus, which is going to create a new pipeline for me. So I'm going to select bus 15, and you can see a new aux track gets created. We've got a new set of pipes. Now, the cool thing about this is that my output for the vocal bus is still bus 13. It's still going into the melodic submix. But I now have this parallel pipe that I can do anything I want to. Now, I want to add some reverb to my vocal. I'm going to go over here and make sure that I'm sending all of the level that I need to. Usually with sends, you actually set a volume level just like you would with a fader. Unless there's a reason not to, you would just want to set it at 0. That way it's sending an exact copy. So now I'm going to go over to the reverb channel and I'm going to put on a reverb plugin. And let's just select Chromaverb. Now this reverb is totally fine for demonstration purposes. The important thing that I want you to know is you want to make sure that any effect you put on a send is 100% wet and 0% dry. Dry is just your original unaffected signal. Wet is your new affected signal. If you've got something on a send, almost every single time you're going to want it to be 100% wet. So let me get out of this. And I'm going to solo my vocal bus and I'm going to mute this reverb. So all you're going to hear is just the vocals.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
But now if I put in the reverb bus,
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
now that's obviously a ton of reverb. So this is why sends are so crucial to be able to use, because what I can do is I can actually turn the volume of this down and subtly mix it in until it sounds perfect with the vocal.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
Just like that. Now let me unsolo this, and we'll do the exact same thing, and I'll just slowly move it in so that it makes sense in the entire mix.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
And let me do the same thing for the background bus.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio. Rolling down the mountain.
And the reason that we're doing this on a send, other than the fact that we can just mix it in, is because now we can create as many sends as we want for other effects, and reverb won't be on every one of them. So for example, let's say I wanted to create another send to create a delay of some kind. So turn that up. We'll call this delay. And let me get a delay plugin up here. And we'll just grab echo.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
Okay, so that's what that sounds like. But now let's see what would happen if I was to put my reverb plugin on the channel. So I'm just going to grab this and move it over here. And I'd have 100% dry, and I'd probably have, 30% wet or something.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
Now listen to that delay. Now the delay is also reverberated.
Rolling down the road, you and me and the radio.
And in terms of the mix, I probably wouldn't want that. I might want my delay to be totally dry and then be able to mix in the reverb until it sounds right in the mix, rather than every single one of my special effects being just full of reverb. Not really something that we want. So all I'd want to do is go over here, move it back over onto my reverb send, set it back to 100% wet and 0% dry, and all of a sudden we have dry delay again.
Roll down the road, you and me and the radio.
So that's how you use a send. This is the piping of your DAW. Being able to create pipes and divert the flow of audio to different places so that you can get new sounds, new effects, more glue. This is going to be one of the biggest steps to you being able to create a professional mix. So that said though, we're not quite done. We've now created the pipelines that we want to have in this particular mix, but how do we actually change how much water is flowing through those pipes? Well, of course, the amount of water is just the same thing as the amount of level, how loud something is. So are we talking about volume or are we talking about gain? Because there's actually a very important difference between the two of them that a lot of people don't know in mixing. Gain is the level of the audio before processing, whereas volume is the level of the audio after processing. Now, whenever I say processing, what am I talking about? I'm talking about plugins. So if I was to go back to my kick drum, for example, let me solo this. Let's say I wanted to put on a compressor and I wanted to compress my kick drum. Now, as I would set up my compressor, I'd get it to a certain point on my threshold and ratio that I was getting the amount of gain reduction that I'd want, right? So I'd turn this on, and maybe I'd set my threshold down a bit, I'd set my ratio higher, until I was getting like 5 dBs of compression. Let's see what happens whenever I turn down the volume. You can see the volume goes down, the level goes down, you hear less of the kick, but we're still getting gain reduction. It's not actually affecting the plugin at all. Now, on the flip side, what if I was to change the gain of the track, the gain of the audio file itself? So I'm going to go over to my audio file, and in Logic, if I want to change the gain, all I would want to do is go over to this little section underneath region, and you can see, let me zoom in, that as I turn this up, the waveform itself actually goes up. And whenever I turn it down, the waveform goes down. This is because we're changing the level of the audio file itself. We're basically changing how loud this thing was recorded. We're not really affecting the volume at all. So let's see what happens to our compression whenever I turn the gain down. I'm gonna hit play, and we're gonna see how much compression we're getting. Okay, 5-6 dBs. Now let me turn the gain down by about 8 dBs or so. Now let's see how much gain reduction we're getting. Almost nothing. And if I keep turning it down, no compression at all. That's because when we turn down the gain, we're turning down the level of the audio file, which means we would actually have to go in here and change up our settings so that we are telling the compressor to target the right place. Now on the flip side, let's see what happens whenever I increase the gain by a ton. I get a lot more compression. Now that turns up the level, but I can still turn the volume down if I wanted to control it. So I'm now doing way more compression, but I'm going to go over here and slowly turn down my volume fader, and we're going to hear the level go down, but we're not actually going to see any less compression. So I've turned it all the way down now, but you can see there's still a lot of water flowing through those pipes. We just put a cap at the very end of the pipe. So now that we know what to call the water that's flowing through our DAW's pipes, what do we actually do to control that water? How do we control how much water is flowing through our pipeline? Well, we can do what's known as gain staging. Now, gain staging refers to 2 different things in a mix. First, it refers to the process of making all of the recordings in a session have similar levels of gain. And second, it refers to the process of making sure a recording is the same level after a plugin as it was before. So for that first definition of gain staging, all that means is I'd be going through my audio files, hitting play, and checking out where exactly they're all peaking at. And I'd be going through and changing the gain so that they're all sort of living on average around the same level. It's really, really helpful for your mix to have everything sitting at around the same level. It makes it a lot faster to mix. But also, if you can set them in a specific level known as the digital sweet spot, you can actually make your plugins sound even better. Now, we've made a video on gain staging and the digital sweet spot. It's on our YouTube page. I've actually put a link down in the description below, so go check that out if you're interested. Now, for the second definition of gain staging, this is something that we want to do throughout our mix. So let me show you an example. So let's say I wanted to grab an EQ and take out a lot of the low end of this particular kick. So let's check out what this would sound like before and after, and specifically listen to how much quieter it sounds after I've EQ'd it. So I've obviously lost a lot of loudness. So I'd want to turn the volume up of this entire plugin so that whatever is coming in before the plugin is the same as what's coming in after the plugin. Now you could try to do this by ear, or you could try to match the number on your volume meter right here, or you could grab another meter like a loudness meter to get a little bit more specific. Let's just try to match this number. So I'm going to turn this off and let's see where it's peaking at. So at about -5.2. Now let's see where it's peaking at. Okay, so we've lost maybe like a dB. So now, whenever I do a before and after, you're going to be able to hear that the loudness stays pretty much the same. The tone's going to change because we've taken so much out of this, but the loudness is going to remain the same. Now, the reason we do this kind of gain staging is that it allows us to be able to turn a plugin on and off and actually hear what we did. Our ears are designed in such a way that we actually perceive loud sounds as sounding better, and we perceive quiet sounds as sounding worse. So we might have actually done some EQing or some compression that has really improved the sound of an instrument, but because we took a lot out of it and it's now quieter, we might actually think it sounds worse. And so we turn the plugins off. On the flip side, we might have added a ton to this particular instrument, and we might think it sounds great, when in reality, we've just wrecked the sound. So unless we set the loudness the same after the plugin as we did before the plugin, it kind of ends up not really mattering as much. You're never going to be able to hear it very accurately. So when we're talking about signal flow, there's one final step that I want to make sure that you know the name for. Really what I'm talking about is if I want to take my audio and make it into a single file, like an MP3, for example. What do I call that? So for the rest of the world, you just call that exporting. You've probably seen that on tons of different programs like Word or PowerPoint or all these different things that your computer has. But for your DAW, sometimes we don't actually use that word. We like to use the word bouncing. So bounce is another word for export. If you're bouncing a track, that means you're just exporting a session into a listenable format, like an MP3 or a WAV file. So putting it in terms of our pipeline, bouncing is like taking a bucket, putting it underneath our water spigot, filling the bucket up, and then taking it somewhere else where we can use it. So in Logic, if you wanted to bounce out a session, you just go up to File, down to Bounce, and then Project or Section. And this fun little pop-up comes up. You select the type of file you want and all of its settings. Then you hit OK. And after you name it, all of a sudden, the bounce starts. Now, the reason this is sometimes so confusing for people is that if you click on File and you go down to Bounce, above it, you can see Export. And below it, you can see Share. And all three of these words are just synonyms for the same thing. So that's part of the reason why, depending on your DAW, it can take a while just to figure out how to create an MP3. Because some DAWs, like GarageBand, for example, only have Share, and other ones only have Export. But regardless, most DAWs use Bounce. And that's it. That's all the most important jargon about signal flow for mixing. Now, there are lots of other tiny vocabulary words that you might see used from time to time, but if you have a solid understanding of all of these core concepts, it is going to be so much easier to learn how to mix like a pro. But here's the thing, just because you know the language doesn't mean you know what to do yet. So that's why Rob Mazes, the founder of Musician on a Mission, he put together a free workshop where he shares the 7 steps to making radio-ready music at home. He's created a new approach to home recording and mixing that's going to help you do all this stuff so much faster. And it hasn't just worked for him. At the time of recording this, over 60,000 people have already been through this workshop, and they've seen results in their music in just a few days. So now it's your turn. If you want to learn the exact 7 steps that will take your mixes to a professional standard in under a year and keep you from wasting precious time and money and effort on all the wrong things, then go and watch the free workshop now. Just click the link on screen or in the description below to get your own access. It's completely free, and seriously, you're going to love it. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We make tutorials and tips just like this one every single week on this channel. We'd love to help you grow. Okay, that's all from me. This has been Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission, and remember, create regardless.